Hey, welcome back. So, in the last couple of weeks here of the course, we just turned to more contemporary figures. Here we go. Here we go. The first one's going to be Richard Rorty, an American philosopher. Died not too long ago, so it's fairly recent. The title of this fairly short article is called Solidarity or Objectivity. It is a question, so we want to keep that in mind. And I'll just mention that there's lots of names and so on dropped in this piece. You can very safely just pass over those. You don't have to worry about some of the more specific debates he's engaged in. His main point, as far as we're concerned, will come through. Basically, we want to think about Rorty here as continuing the sort of thought that we had with Hume, a kind of skepticism. So specifically, we can say a kind of skepticism with regard to objectivity. That word will be used here kind of more or less in the way you probably understand it, right? When we think of objective as, say, opposed to subjective or somehow relative. Basically, what we saw with Hume was that, what we might consider, the best kind of human knowledge, basically empirical scientific knowledge, isn't necessarily objective in a strict sense, but is rather relative in a certain way to human beings' manner of perceiving and understanding things. That's not necessarily a problem at all. Basically, we're all, so to speak, in the same boat. It could be an issue if we encounter extraterrestrials, but whatever. We'll cross that bridge if we ever get to it. But basically, Hume had pointed out that sort of a certain ideal of objectivity isn't quite sort of lived up to. Basically, in the intervening years, we've passed over a couple of centuries here, people kind of developed this more and added to it the idea that, well, it's not just our manner of perceiving and understanding, but there is also sort of social or cultural and historical factors that go into shaping how we see and understand things. It's basically taking up that idea that Rorty is going with here. So the question, solidarity or objectivity, is basically a question about how best to make sense of things. You remember that's how we think about philosophy and other things that we do. We try to make sense of our experience and what's going on. He says, roughly at least we can think about these in two different ways. There is the second way, or the way that kind of he's going to be opposed to. It's very important to keep this in mind. He's going to be opposed to objectivity. That's the way, in a sense, that he lines up with Hume. And that is basically where we might recognize that, yes, there are certain biases or assumptions that are part of our own time and place, but that we ought to try to rise above this. This is something that was discovered long ago, and it's kind of connected with the origins of Western philosophy at least. That basically we just recognize, yes, we kind of initially come at things with certain biases that we inherit from our social and historical surroundings, but we should try to do better, try to rise above that to something more objective that would be true for everybody. So typically for most people, science fulfills this ideal. So the other line of thinking here is actually to recognize, sure, there are these kinds of built-in biases and so on, preconceptions that go with different communities. That's the word he's going to use, and he uses that word because he wants to emphasize basically that human beings live in certain, communities. We often say society, but he's trying to emphasize that there's something deeply in common. And basically the idea with what he's saying about so-called solidarity, and we're going to see more about it, is that we should just stick with that, actually. That there's actually something wrong-headed about trying to rise above those ideas and values and so on that are associated with different communities. And we should actually just make sense of our experience in those terms, not try to rise above them, as has been sort of the kind of default assumption for quite some time now. So the idea here is he's actually like Hume, but going further. Whereas Hume said something like, well, our understanding of the world around us is relative to human nature, say. That human nature is the same for everybody, though. Rorty is taking it that step further and saying actually it's relative to different social and historical communities. So there are important differences. We're not all in the same boat. and it actually is wrong to try to get into the same boat. That's going to be the idea that he develops here. Let me get back here. Let's see. Okay, so first of all, he's going to say a little bit more about what he means by objectivity. As I mentioned, this is something you probably already have an idea of, and it's not far off what he's basically saying. He's just saying there is this ideal of objectivity where we really think we can rise above any kind of bias or preconceptions, attain a certain truth that would not be tied to certain times or places. It would be the same for everybody. Kind of the ideal that is pursued, again, in particular by science, basically. But he's going to call this into question, keep it in mind. But here he's just clarifying what he means by that. So as I say, even when we think about the other thinkers we've looked at, basically, he could say, they were all kind of bound to this idea, even though the forms their particular theories took could appear very, very different, right? There's always a deeper question that they seem to have in common. So here he'd say that we're committed to this ideal of objectivity. So one good way of thinking about this is with regard to the idea of truth. And this is basically where this very important argument comes out. Although I should say, and Rorty doesn't take credit for this entirely, and it's not entirely novel with him, but it's basically just to think about the idea of truth. It's a handy way this kind of ties together ideas about reality and about knowledge in forms of truth. Usually there's some idea of what we usually call correspondence, right? Something is true, something we say or claim is true, just in case it actually is that way in reality. Right? That's a fairly ordinary way of thinking about things. The problem is, and this goes all the way back to the very beginning of the course when we talked about that definition of knowledge, right? Where we talked about justification as being kind of the crucial element. How do we ever get that criterion of truth in order for this kind of correspondence to be shown? It's a big problem, because it seems to suggest there's something circular. So in particular, and this has a particular edge when it comes to people who claim to have objective knowledge, because they are implicitly claiming that they have in their possession, so to speak, the criterion of objective knowledge, or the criterion of objectivity. They have to have knowledge of that. But then we can just always ask them, well, how do you know that that is indeed the criterion of objectivity? They can try to reply, but we can just ask the same question once again, and so on, and it never ends. Basically, he's merely pointing out, in this super simple way, that it's actually not quite possible to have objective knowledge in the way that people typically assume, just like anything else. And this is exactly sort of reflecting what Hume was talking about with empirical reasoning. It always has to take the relevant criterion on faith. It can never be shown objectively what it means to have objective knowledge. It would just always be begging the question. This is not hard to understand. What seems to be most important, and what I think Rorty wants us to do, is just take it to heart. Actually really see what this very simple little piece of reasoning is showing us. I'm going to usually refer to this as the criterion argument. The fact that you cannot have a criterion of objectivity. People can claim to have objective knowledge all they like, but it's never what they think it is. It is always, based upon some criterion that ultimately they have to take on faith. So the switch occurs here. He's going to develop a very different approach. This is where we get into kind of his positive view, basically, a kind of pragmatic view. So where pragmatism, in a general sense, is where, you kind of focus on getting things done, basically. And here the idea in philosophy is that we just think about philosophical concepts, for example, truth, in their practical terms. So here, it's completely different. Here, he thinks, truth is supposed to be understood as what it is good to believe, right? What works. And then there's always this added, for us. Us is always referring to some human community. Could be the one we happen to live in, some community somewhere else or at some other time. There's always some kind of built-in consensus about truth. And this is really getting to what he means by there being a deep common ground that holds a community together. There's always something, a conception of truth. It's going to be one further thing we'll add in just a moment. But basically this is a very different approach. You can just see how sharply different this is. It is what it is good for us to believe, what works. And this can change, of course. Circumstances change. What is good for us to take to be true can change, and that's not a problem. The question can come up whether this is relativism, and in a certain sense it looks like it is, because he's basically saying truth is connected to or relative to different human communities. But really, he kind of wants to take issue with that, because he'd say, well, no, what we mean by relativism, is something that kind of comes in second place to some sort of absolute truth. But the criterion argument shows us that idea of absolute truth is just, a non-starter. It's just a myth. It's just an illusion. There's no such thing. It's not possible. Meaning this is as good as it gets. He's basically just describing sort of how humans have gone about thinking and gaining knowledge and trying to understand things, recognizing that as a matter of fact, this is tied to the circumstances of different historical communities, and that's it. So he thinks it's not really relativism in any bad sense. It's just a more accurate description of what's actually going on. And note the term he gives to this. It's very striking, right? He calls this an ethnocentric view. Now, he may have written this before that term ethnocentric took a particularly negative connotation. He means it fairly literally, basically. The ethnos just as meaning the different communities. It's the same term as ethnic or ethics, even for that matter. It's just the truth is centered on communities. So in contrast to something like Hume, which is an anthropocentric view, it's centered on just humanity as a whole. Rorty's taking this further step and saying it's actually relative to different human communities. And then he has this nice little phrase here, which seems a little wonky, but it's actually quite good when he says there's nothing to be said about truth or rationality apart from descriptions of the familiar procedures of justification. It's a good phrase, which a given society, always referred to in the first person plural, uses in one or another area of inquiry. So that's a really good little phrase there, procedures of justification. He's really saying what really holds a certain community together and what really gives it its particular identity is how they go about determining if something is to be taken as true. Being true always means the same thing in general from community to community, but the actual content can and does vary. Right? People can think different things are true, but for everybody, something's being true is very important, and it forms the basis of how they go about their actions and behaviors and so on. The crucial thing is that the different communities will justify things in different ways. Some communities might justify things on the basis, say, of empirical science. That's great. Others might base things on certain, religious texts, for example. Other people may base it on the stars. There could be any number of ways in principle that people justify, right? How they actually take a certain view and boost it up to the level of what they consider to be true. And that's really the amazing thing that holds a community together. There's a consensus basically there, at least implicitly. Most people may have no clear explicit idea of this, but that's what's basically going on. And he thinks, this is going to be part of the reason why we should sort of more, say, directly and self-consciously espouse this and go with this rather than leaving it behind. It's really because it is what keeps a community healthy and, say, strong and vibrant and so on. I'm going to pause this and make a second part.